Thank you so much, Opeyemi, for joining us on the show today.
My pleasure.
Well,
Thanks.
we have our own war. We have our own war on terror going on in Nigeria. Almost every other day, we begin to hear of attacks, bombings. Of course, it has a religious dimension now. But give us a sense of what we can learn from this recent judgment and gathering international support for how we go about waging this war against terror in Nigeria.
Well, so far, the only attempt at internationalizing the Boko Haram matter has been in the U.S., where the Senate, I think, debated or considered whether to designate Boko Haram as a foreign terrorist organization. Of course, that would have then, if that designation was made, would have allowed the U.S. government to impose sanctions and all of that. I don't think that process has been completed, essentially because I perceive that there was some strong lobbying, ironically from some elites in northern Nigeria and some academics who are friendly with them, who then argued that designating Boko Haram a foreign terrorist organization would in effect be like the U.S. government siding against the North. I think that was the argument they made, which I found curious, given that we had all agreed domestically that Boko Haram was a terrorist organization, not a northern organization or an Islamic organization. So that process, where I'm watching to see how the U.S. Senate resolves that issue.
Right. But of course, it's taking a toll on the economy. And even though the latest GDP numbers are still fairly positive, 7.6% for the fourth quarter, there's a sense that there's definitely an economic impact of this whole terrorist.
I think the tragedy of Boko Haram is that it's destroying the most vulnerable segments of the Nigerian economy. Many of these states, Borno, Yobe, Adamawa, many of these states in the north are precisely those places where you need a lot of action to reduce poverty, to create employment, to create commercial activity. So first of all, it's clear that Boko Haram is decimating the local economies.
And that's
areas of
the
operations.
development we're seeing, and it's really focused on the north. So the north is really in trouble, if you like.
In economic terms, you can imagine the impact on the economies of those local economies up north. Although I've also heard for some businesses, I've had credible reports, in some cases, surprisingly, that the volumes have not diminished, even in places like Borno and Maiduguri in particular, and so on.
But what I'm hearing now is that youths, for instance, are resigning jobs in the north, coming back south. People who have opportunities to work in the north are not taking those opportunities.
Oh, clearly.
Now that dynamic, what impact do you think it's going to have?
Clearly, like I said, it's destroying those elements, those parts of the Nigerian economy, which it might not affect national GDP figures, because these are marginal contributors to the GDP figures. So it's worse that these areas where you need more of investment, more of commercial and industrial activity, more of social investment in education and health and all, and water and all, is precisely those areas where they're being set back decades, in my view.
Yeah, but, like, for instance, we know that there's a big push for agriculture, and the north is very central to that. So if we're seeing situations where people don't even want to go to the north to work, and new investments that are going to the north, for instance, we just heard recently that there was an attack close to the Lafarge investment, Ashaka Cement, somewhere in northern Nigeria. And there's a sense that, the north is the place not to go right now.
You're right. I know businesses that are considering diversifying their assets even in the north. So looking to create potential areas where they can shift factories to, shift businesses to. So that's the tragedy of it all. Of course, now it's affecting the whole country's image. And therefore, maybe it would affect existing businesses, many of which are in the south, but it may be deferring new investment. New investors will look more carefully at Nigeria, except for those who are really knowledgeable about the country structure and how far Maiduguri is from Lagos or Ibadan or Port Harcourt. But even beyond that, even in spite of that, new investors will wonder about the safety of a country in which one half of it is engulfed in terror. And the question they'll ask themselves is, what stops it from coming down?
Right. Now, coming back to the discussion, international discussion on war crimes, there are definitely strong calls for more intervention in places like Syria to get people accountable. And then we're seeing a situation where, yes, of course, we've seen this recent judgment relating to activity in the Congo. Getting more international support for the war on terror in Nigeria. What do you think?
I totally support that. I think even in terms of detection, in terms of intelligence gathering, in terms of counterterrorism operations, the Nigerian government clearly, and the military and the intelligence bodies will clearly benefit from global cooperation. The second part of it, why that is also imperative, is that we've seen traces of Al-Qaeda. By all accounts, the Sokoto two foreigners, the Briton and the Italian, may have been killed by some variant of Al-Qaeda in the north. Boko Haram clearly does not seem to have been the one. And then we know that there's a regional dimension to this. In Chad, in Niger, in Cameroon, in Somalia, traces of which have been seen active in the Boko Haram activity. So that also increases the logic, the argument for a more international response. And of course, we also need to recognize that the inspiration, at least, if not actual capacity building for Boko Haram, came from international terrorism. And so we need to take into account, and I totally believe that a globalization of the matter would help. It would help to deter, if not the operatives, but the sponsors and those inspiring.
All right, the final point from you now. Where do you see this going? Boko Haram has now become part of Nigeria's discussion right now. Where do you see things going?
I think one must note, though, that at the strategic level, Nigerian government has gained a lot of victories over Boko Haram. At the strategic level, destroying its leadership, arresting some of the key operators, destabilizing the organization. But what has then happened is at its retail strategic level, Boko Haram, partly because it's frustrated with its recent losses, has now gone retail. And it only takes one or two people to carry out a suicide bomb.
Now, retail is a very interesting way to describe terrorism.
That's the way it's going, and it's a lot more difficult. If something is working at the strategic level, you can trap it. But when it just splinters and
it's certainly a tough one for the government, and it'll be interesting to see how things play out. Thank you so much, Opeyemi Agbaje, joining us in the studio to discuss terrorism in Nigeria and how we can collaborate with the rest of the world.